Hey, everybody, thank you for tuning into our virtual Bible study. Tonight, we are delving into the second half of lesson number 9. So, if you're looking at titles and you're wondering which one you should be watching, this is lesson number 9, part B. We covered part A last time. So, if you've not seen part A, I might recommend that you go back and take a look at that. And because we're going to segue right into tonight's lesson, and you'll probably need the first part to understand the second part. You can watch it, but you'll probably be benefited more by going back and looking at the first part of lesson number 9, and then tonight as the follow-up, or the sort of the not just the continuation, but the finishing of lesson number 9. And then we've got a few more lessons to follow after that, but we're looking at a very needed subject. I would call it controversial, not because I believe there's any merit to the argument, but tonight we're looking for the second time at the issue of pain and suffering, evil and suffering in the world, and what that does or doesn't say about God. And the argument, if you may remember last week, is something to the effect of, if God is so good and if he's so powerful, why would he let it happen, or why can't he stop it? And if he can't and he won't, then he's not really a good God or a great God after all. That's the argument. So we're going to continue that in just a second. Real quick. If you're on YouTube, please do give us a thumbs up and then hit the subscribe button below. We want your subscription because we need you to view these videos. Comment below if you have a comment. But we're trying to push this out so that it's more visible, so that people have access to it. In a world that is, I would think, largely turned against God in our culture, especially American culture, we believe this viewpoint is very needed for the conversation and give people a chance to make rational, reasonable decisions based on the evidence. We think that's what we're presenting. We believe that with all of our heart. Also, if you're on Facebook, please give us a thumbs up and share this video on your timeline. That's really important because by doing that, we gain access to the people on your friends and families list, your friends list, who may not already be in touch with this Facebook page for the congregation. So we gain viewers that way. Help us out. Please help us to do that. All right, right into the lesson. And I don't think we have as long a lesson tonight as we had last week. After all, this is the sort of the finishing up of part A last week. So tonight is part B. The question of evil and suffering in the world. And we talked about the argument, why the argument doesn't work. But before I move to the next stage of our study, I do want to say this. The real force of this argument, the real appeal of this argument, is in the emotion of the argument itself. And it appeals to people, especially in an emotionally compromised state, more than it does to the logic of, what is true and what's in accordance with reality. When we are asked to contemplate God in relation to suffering, we're almost always at our most compromised state, right? We resort to our deepest experience of pain as the standard by which we evaluate that. All of us do it, right? We tend to think of it in terms of what we've experienced, whether that is perhaps the death of a loved one, or deep suffering that comes out of, for example, cancer or another disease that ravages the body. And we're being asked to evaluate this argument using that as the standard of it, instead of what is reasonable and what is logical and what is right. And I'm not denying the need for emotion, and that's not part of the human experience, because it is. But emotion is not an evaluator of, you don't evaluate reality on the basis of emotion, because emotion is a very subjective thing. Some people experience it more than others do. It's just not the standard by which we evaluate what is true and what is not true, but emotion is part of how we are built. And if people end their evaluation by rejecting the knowledge of God, it tends to be based on the emotional response of it right? Out of anger, for example. They're angry that God would do that. That's how they've come to reason that God did this to them, and they're angry at God, and so they reject God. And they choose that course based on emotion rather than a choice compelled by any real evidence to the premise of the argument. Is it true that God is the cause of the suffering or the pain? And is it true that he must stop suffering and pain in order to keep on being God? We talked about those things last week. This is where I'd encourage you to go back and, if you haven't seen last week's lesson or the lesson number 9a, go back and look at that. It's very important to understand how faulty that argument is in some of the assumptions it makes about God. But I'm going to tell you, I know firsthand several people, by name, I know them, and some dear friends who have given up on God because of their personal experience with pain and suffering. They've lost their faith, so to speak. I've known some people to do that. And they end up rejecting the knowledge of God because of the emotional pain of a really terrible, bad situation. And I know that in my experience, in several instances, I've walked into a room when someone has just learned of a great tragedy and heard someone screaming, why? Why would God do this? All right. So it's an emotional response, and sometimes the anger gets directed in the wrong place. So that emotional component is a real appeal to the argument about evil and suffering. But tonight we want to shift away from what we talked about last week in the first part of the study to understanding how it happens, why it exists in this world. Because the argument is flawed, and we talked about the reasons why the argument is flawed for many reasons, among which is a devaluing of suffering and attributing suffering to God. It's if somehow suffering is completely a bad thing for people. We're going to talk in just a moment about some of the benefits of suffering. It's actually beneficial that we go through some of the things that we go through. To begin, we want to be really crystal clear that suffering and evil, the existence of evil in the world and the existence of suffering in the world, that was never God's plan. To somehow point a finger at us and say, you're just fine with the existence. Well, God is not fine with the existence of it. That was never his plan for the world. He never wanted man to experience bad and the consequences of bad. But he did give us freedom of choice. And that's what it's all going to boil down to. So I'm going to read from the Bible. I know if you're an atheist and you're listening, you may not like the fact that I'm reading from Scripture. And we've, to this point, we've talked about philosophically, you can understand that God exists without even having to open the Bible because the evidence is there according to Romans chapter 1, verse 20. We're surrounded by the evidence of God's fingerprints everywhere. They're just everywhere. But I do want to mention Scripture tonight. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, and then what happens in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, and notice a couple of things. And we're going to be reasonable in our reading of this and what we're going to say. So, first of all, I want to read chapter 1, verses 26 through 28. So, verse 26 beginning. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image." That's important. "According to our likeness." So we're made in the image of God, after his likeness. "Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Okay, so the man and the woman, because you have some supplemental material in chapter 2, they were both created in God's image. There's not a single person, a human being, who's not made in the image of God. And today that would be by procreation, then by creation, but it's still the same. We are in the image of God. So verse 28, he blessed them. He said, "Be fruitful, be multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Okay, so he establishes man. Man is created in God's image. Let's go to chapter 2. Let's take a look at verse 16 and 17. "And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden you may freely eat. Have at it. You're welcome to eat of all the trees except one. But of the tree of the knowledge, verse 17, of good and evil, you will not eat of it. You shall not eat of it. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. Okay, so he's putting some dietary law down for the garden. Tells him you can eat of all the trees. You're welcome to eat whatever you want to eat in the garden. But there's one you cannot. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You cannot eat of that. And the consequence attached to that is that if you would eat it, you're going to die. In that day you'll die. Or dying, you'll die, literally. Okay? So then in chapter 3, if I can summarize, the devil comes on the scene. He tempts the woman. He basically gets her to question divine authority. Interestingly, he draws attention to God in a way that God is not. He almost, in verse 1, makes God seem overly restrictive, which he's not. As if somehow God has kept back something good for them. And her response initially is good. She goes, God told us not to eat the tree. Don't even touch it. And he goes, you're not going to die. And you see that down in verse 4, the devil says, he goes, you're not going to die. Because God knows that it's really good for you. If you eat this, you're going to be wise and you're going to be independent away from God. You don't need him to rule your life. And then in verse 6, she eats, Adam eats, and there's a world of trouble that comes behind that. So let's talk about these passages for just a minute. A couple of things. In Genesis 1, verses 26 through 28, we find our uniqueness being stated in this passage. We are made in the image of God. That's what makes us unique. That means that we are posited with unique qualities that separate us from the rest of everything else in creation. From all life, we are different from that. And it elevates us. We're put on a pedestal, right? We are the pinnacle of creation. We're put in a place whereupon we can have dominion and stewardship over all the earth. We've been given that. Only human beings have been given that, according to verse 26 through verse 28 of Genesis chapter 1. Among those qualities that we've been given that make us so unique, one is the ability that we possess to make moral decisions. And you see that in chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. When he tells them, you can eat of all the trees, you can decide to do that, but there's one that you must not eat of. Now, it's your power to do it, because I'm telling you, don't do it. But if you do, then here's the consequence attached to that. No other creature can do that. We can make moral decisions. And as we say, man is a free moral agent. Sometimes you'll hear that language. We are that. We are free moral agents. We have volition. We have the ability to make moral choices. So we possess a freedom to decide in moral issues. We have that choice, that matter. Now, when we are provided the task of exercising dominion over the earth, there is inherent within that charge a right of human beings, because we possess that right, because we're made in the image of God, to make decisions so as to best exercise that stewardship. It's fitting of the way that we're made. If it is God's making the choice for us, then we're nothing but robots, right? We're not a steward of the earth, but we're stewards of the earth. That's what God said in verses 26 through verse 28. He said, let them have dominion, right? So it illustrates that we're like God in that capacity, that we possess a freedom of will. And even though God provides the course that we're to pursue, there is within that the implied ability to react to that course. He sets the course, and now we get to make decisions based on that. We react to that. Dominion is our possession. That's what God has given us, implying the right of intelligent decision making. So in chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, God gives them a choice of the eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And he tells them, don't do it because there's a consequence attached to it. But you can eat of everything else. So when he says you may freely eat, that is divine permission. But as it's a clear affirmation of free will. It's a clear free affirmation of will anywhere in the Bible where he says you may freely eat. You can do this. It's your prerogative to do that. You have the right to do that. But in condemning the eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God presents man with a choice and demonstrates the ability of man to choose between the two options. We have that choice. And to decide for himself which course we will pursue. We can either eat or we cannot eat. But it's our choice to make. The wrong choice leads to death. And I find it interesting in this passage that sometimes people who speak of the power and the love of God often as a way of trying to denounce God based on his power and love in the question of human suffering, when it is the love and the power of God that are precisely the keys to refuting that in this passage. The power of God includes his sovereignty, and that he has the right to make the decisions ultimately and set a path for us to go. And it is the love of God that posits us with the ability on our own to choose our course. We have freedom of choice because he loves us. He does that. In Genesis 2:16 and 17, that's what that passage is all about. Love grants people the freedom to make a choice. In response, man's love for God is evidenced by obedience. He doesn't have to suffer death as long as he obeys God, and he would do it because he loves God. And his action has to be free, or that's not love, right? You can program a computer to say every time you turn it on, I love you, you're the best looking thing in the whole wide world, but it doesn't mean anything because it's a computer. We are not made that way. We're made with freedom of choice, which also means we have the freedom to choose the wrong thing. Disobedience is dislove, right? It's a rejection of the love of God. Disobedience is a rejection of a loving God. It's a rejection of love that has consequences to it. And here that consequence is death. So in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, when sin enters the world, Satan is tempting the woman. And by the way, that temptation is proof that God is not the originator of evil. It started with Satan. He's the one that started that. God is not the cause of it. The devil caused that. Satan is tempting her in an effort to have the woman reject the love of God. He doesn't want her to believe it anymore. In fact, he says in verse 5 that God did not want them, the man and the woman, to know something that, and when he says that, he was actually partially correct. Now, he puts it in such a way that it is a lie, but it's true that God never wanted the man and the woman to experience sin because sin is a rejection of the love of God, and God never wanted that for the man and the woman. But the choice is the woman's to make. And that is proof that we all have a choice to make. We all make choices. And the potential for evil and the potential for suffering is always attached to the freedom of choice. Always. If you have freedom to choose, then it's possible you could make a choice that leads to your suffering or leads to the production of evil in this world. So when evil enters the world, along with that comes suffering. Both moral evil and natural evil are introduced because of sin. And you see that in this passage. You see shame and fear and blame, and you see the changing of the world as a result of that. So biologically and socially and morally and philosophically and socially, you go through all those tiers of suffering. They're all evidenced right here in Genesis chapter 3. In fact, in Romans 8, if you want to follow that up, read verses 20 through 22, where Paul is talking about how the world was subjected in a way it was never meant to because of sin. And the world personified there is longing for the day when it's going to be released from that. So to argue, as some people do, that in order for God to exist, he has to eliminate suffering is not true, because God is not responsible for evil, and he desired that man would never suffer the consequences of evil. Now that evil is in the world, and now that suffering is in the world from its entrance, God can actually use that, because that's the power of God and his love, to actually better his people through that. So just real quick, I just want to run through, and I get in the class, we're probably going to have some really great discussion on this. I can't convey the live conversation in this format. But here are some benefits I jotted down in my notes for pain and suffering. Pain and suffering can actually work to warn us of impending danger. Sometimes we suffer things in life, but it actually is a warning about greater danger on the horizon. That's a positive benefit that comes from suffering. Pain and suffering can help us to avoid greater suffering in the future. Sometimes you experience a little bit of suffering now so that you can avoid a much greater deal of suffering in the future. It can also teach us moral consequences. It's a teacher. We can learn from it. You learn from suffering. You learn from evil in the world, either by the experience at the hands of someone else or by your personal experience of it, but you learn from it. It's also a way of grabbing our moral attention, right? It's a way of helping us to develop certain mindsets and certain attitudes toward the realities of life. can help us develop character, right? We talked about some of those at the end last week. Sometimes you can't develop courage unless you're facing fear. Sometimes you can't learn to be patient unless you've been tried in your patience. Suffering can actually help develop proper values. Some of the greatest people in the world are people who've immensely suffered, but they've learned to be better people as a result, and they are the best of people as a result of that. Pain and suffering causes us to seek help from others and learn the value of benevolence and kindness. It takes suffering in order for there to be compassion to be showed. Pain and suffering helps us to appreciate our blessings. It takes the rough times to help you appreciate the good times. And pain and suffering causes us to look toward God. Sometimes it takes that for people to turn upward in their look and finally appeal to God. And I'm sure you can think of some that I did not write down, but pain and suffering are not altogether bad. Okay? God didn't want it, but now that it's in the world, because He is loving and because He is powerful, He can use those in ways that benefit us. Most of all, to help us turn our attention toward Him and reciprocate His love by submitting to Him and loving Him for the rest of our life, and then going to be with Him forever one day. Hey, thank you for tuning in. I hope you'll pair this with the previous lesson and get the full argument out of both of those lessons. We'll be moving on to a few extra additional subject matters in our study of the existence of God, and then we'll be wrapping it up. We're getting really near the end as we draw to a close of the study, which means we'll have something else brand new coming up in the future. Thanks for tuning in so much. I can't wait to see you next week. Please, if you have questions, get with me. I'm glad to answer any way I can and talk with you. I'm not unkind. I'll be glad to talk, and I promise I'll be nice in doing it. I just think this is a really important subject, if not the most important, because it's the starting point for everything else, and I'm glad to help in any way that I can. We are at North Hamilton Church of Christ. We're glad to do that. Hey, until I see you next week, please know I love you. God loves you even more than I do, and we'll see you next time.